The winch on a commercial trawler is designed to handle a specific range of resistance. When the load exceeds that capacity, the machinery grinds to a halt. In 2004, aboard the fishing vessel Konstantinos K, the crew faced a sudden tension spike on their portside gear. They were working south of Rhodes, roughly 7 miles off the island's southern cape, with the trawl running deep, about 150 meters down. The resistance was not biological. The net had fouled on a rigid, geometric structure. Captain Spiros Varvaris hauled the heavy load toward shallower water and reported the incident to the coast authorities. In the days that followed, a local diver verified the contact and marked the position. The discovery then activated a forensic process inside the Hellenic Air Force. This is the primary failure mode of valid archaeological sites in the Mediterranean. A snag event applies unchecked force to a corroded structure, often tearing the artifact apart before its location is even registered. In this case, the first clues were small: corroded aluminum and steel fragments caught in the mesh, enough to suggest the tail of a combat aircraft. Most aviation archaeology begins with a specific search grid driven by archival loss records. This case began with a random kinetic collision. By the time the site was fixed off Prassonisi, the wreck lay in about 15 meters, roughly 49 feet, of water, about half a mile off the coast. This depth creates a specific engineering paradox. At roughly 49 feet, the wreck is easy for humans to reach, yet it still sits inside the high-energy zone of coastal hydraulics. Storm surge and currents push abrasive sand across the seabed, flexing a weakened airframe and scouring away protective oxide films. The site was not a stable grave. It was an asset in active decay. The Konstantinos had unwittingly located one of the rarest airframes in the European theater. Initial diver reconnaissance revealed a single-engine monoplane lying inverted and partially buried. The shallow depth meant the site was vulnerable to unauthorized salvage and souvenir hunting. Once the coordinates are known, the integrity of the site evaporates. The Hellenic Air Force Underwater Operations Team, known as KOSYTHE, was tasked to assess the contact and plan a safe recovery. Their first objective was not recovery but identification. The Mediterranean floor is littered with the debris of 3 years of heavy air combat. Thousands of machines from the Royal Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and the Regia Aeronautica were lost in this sector. Without a serial number or a unit code, this was just anonymous debris. The wreckage required a name to justify the risk of a recovery operation. The physical evidence presented a complex geometry. The structure was heavily encrusted, blending with the seabed. 63 years of immersion had allowed marine growth to colonize every hard surface, masking the telltale engineering lines that distinguish a fighter from a bomber. The divers were looking for a net snag point, the specific jagged edge that had caught the fishing gear. A net snag in aviation archaeology serves as a destructive marker. While it damages the artifact, it also clears a localized window through the marine growth. The friction of the nylon or steel cables strips away decades of biofouling, sometimes revealing paint or primer that has been hidden since the 1940s. However, this mechanical violence creates a fracture risk. If the net had pulled on a main spar, the wing might already be separated from the fuselage. In deep water recoveries, the primary constraint is pressure. Here, it was chemistry. The wreck sat in oxygenated saltwater, an aggressive electrolyte, and the mixed metal structure was dissolving in place. If the aluminum was moved without rigid support, it could crumble under its own weight. The Konstantinos had proven the site existed. The open question was whether the corroded pile still had enough continuity to lift, or whether the history inside it had already been reduced to oxide and silt. 63 years in this shallow, oxygen-rich environment offered none of the protection a deep ocean wreck might enjoy. The seabed off Prassonisi behaved like a working reactor, cycling corrosion day after day until an engineering problem became a race against total molecular dissociation. To understand the condition of the metal, we must reconstruct the energy state at the moment of entry. The loss is most often placed on October 9, 1943, during the Battle of the Dodecanese, when German forces were striking at Allied control of the islands in the Aegean. That day, Ju-87s attacked Royal Navy and Hellenic Navy ships southwest of Rhodes, including HMS Carlisle, as the force returned from operations west of Kos. The tactical constraints that day were absolute. The Stuka was a low-speed precision platform operating in an airspace dominated by high-speed energy fighters. Accounts of the interception vary, and the exact chain of fire for this particular aircraft remains contested. A plausible explanation is that USAAFP-38s, often associated in the reporting with the 37th Fighter Squadron and led that day by Major William Leverett, caught the Stukas as they moved against the warships. If that reading is correct, the engagement was a mismatch of physics. The twin-engine P-38s possessed a significant energy advantage, using slash-and-run tactics against the slower dive bombers. The damage pattern on the recovered wreckage suggests a procedural story, but it cannot deliver certainty on its own. This was not a high-altitude disintegration. The airframe appears to have entered the water in a relatively coherent state, though it may have been compromised by combat damage. Some combat reports describe heavy machine gun and cannon fire capable of igniting fuel or damaging an engine. When an aircraft strikes the water at low altitude and high speed, deceleration can strip away external stores and fixed landing gear. If a pilot retains partial control, the fuselage may skim for a split second before the drag of the sea brutally arrests forward motion. Once the kinetic energy dissipated, the aircraft settled in shallow water. From that point on, the destruction shifted from impact trauma to electrochemical decay. The Ju87 is not a monolithic aluminum structure. It pairs a steel central spar and steel fittings with aluminum skin and ribs. In seawater, that mixed metal build becomes a corrosion trap. The mechanism driving this decay is the aluminum-steel galvanic reaction. When two dissimilar metals are electrically connected and immersed in seawater, they form a galvanic couple. The less noble metal, in this case the aluminum, acts as the anode and sacrifices itself to protect the steel cathode. Over 6 decades, the saltwater facilitates a continuous electron flow that eats away the aluminum alloy at the molecular level. The steel components survive, often heavily encrusted but structurally sound, while the aluminum skins around them turn into a brittle oxide paste. This reaction explains the fragility of the site. The visually intact sections of the fuselage are deceptive. The bonds holding the rivets to the skin have likely dissolved, leaving the marine concretion as the only material holding the shape of the aircraft. Any attempt to lift the wreck forces the weakened aluminum to carry loads it was designed to bear only when factory fresh. The recovery logic is further constrained by the possibility of a war grave. The aircraft did not return to base, and the crew is listed as missing in action in the available reporting. That means the cockpit could still hold human traces. Ethically, that shifts the wreck from scrap to a place of loss. Any recovery plan has to preserve context, protect potential remains, and document the cockpit sediment, because what lies inside may matter as much as the metal itself. The team faced a compound problem. The snag that revealed the wreck may also have disturbed the crew's resting place, and galvanic corrosion was steadily erasing whatever context remained. Leaving the airframe on the bottom meant allowing the sea to complete the destruction. Bringing it up meant risking the last fragile connection still holding the story together. In water, this shallow visual identification is compromised by marine growth. When the KOSYTHE divers first descended, they weren't studying clean industrial lines. They were reading a reef shaped like an aircraft, searching for proof that this was more than anonymous debris. To justify the risk of recovery, they needed an identity. This process relies on identification triangulation. In aviation forensics, a single data point is rarely sufficient. A code painted on a fuselage can be obscured or duplicated across different theaters. A crash location can be approximate. True confirmation requires the intersection of 3 distinct vectors: the physical markings on the wreck, the unit loss records from the specific date, and the combat reports from the opposing force. Unless all 3 align without contradiction, the identity remains a hypothesis rather than a fact. The divers began by gently cleaning the fuselage sections that remained accessible. The corrosion trap described in the previous chapter had done its work, pitting the metal and fusing sand to the skin. However, under the layers of concretion, the original Luftwaffe paint offered a faint but legible signature. The team located the alphanumeric code painted on the side of the fuselage, Sierra 7 Golf Mike. This code, S7 plus GM, provided the first vector of the triangulation. In the Luftwaffe marking system, the prefix S7 is associated with Sturzkampfgeschwader 3, while the remaining characters identify the individual aircraft and its Staffel. This narrowed the search from thousands of potential Stukas to a far smaller set operating in the Rhodes sector. The second vector came from the factory data plate. Every German aircraft carried a work number, a unique construction number stamped into the airframe and recorded on its plate. The divers located a plate consistent with the number 100375. Taken together, these markings strongly suggest a Ju87 D-3 trop built for tropical service. But the identification still needs to be treated as a conclusion supported by multiple lines of evidence, not a single magic stamp. With the physical evidence locked, the investigation turned to the archives to test the match. The loss record for Sturzkampfgeschwader 3 on October 9, 1943, shows a heavy toll, commonly reported as 9 Ju87 D-3 trop lost in the action, though some published summaries differ by a small margin. By cross-referencing the work number and the fuselage code, investigators could narrow the identity to a specific entry in the records. In Hellenic Air Force reporting, the most probable match links the aircraft to Lieutenant Rolf Metzger and Unteroffizier Hans Zoppnemann, both listed as missing in action. The adversary account can be made consistent with the broader damage and the battle narrative, but it cannot deliver a single courtroom-grade verdict. The crash position fits a crippled bomber failing to reach Rhodes, yet whether the final moments were a controlled ditching, a partial loss of control, or a violent descent remains an inference rather than a documented fact. That shift in certainty changed the mission. This was no longer anonymous scrap. It was the retrieval of a specific machine tied to two named men who never returned home. While no human remains were immediately visible in the sediment during the initial survey, the cockpit area remained a primary concern. The sediment inside the fuselage could still contain the only physical traces of Metzger and Sonnemann. The survey also revealed the extent of the structural compromise. The tail section was separated, a common failure point in ditching scenarios where the fuselage snaps behind the stiff wing box. The engine was detached or buried. What remained was the center section and the cockpit, the heart of the aircraft. The Kosith team now had a positive identity, but they also had a confirmed structural liability. They knew exactly what they were lifting, but they also knew that the aircraft was held together largely by habit and marine growth. The next phase required a transition from forensic analysis to heavy engineering. Airframes are engineered for lift, not for excavation. When a recovery team tries to raise an aluminum fuselage that has spent decades absorbing water and sediment, the load paths invert, and the stresses land where Junkers engineers never had to model them. In flight, the wings carry the fuselage. On the ground, the landing gear does. On the seabed, you're asking corroded longerons to take a vertical hoist while the shell is still packed with mud. On October 5, 2006, the WWII team initiated the extraction phase off Rhodes' southern cape. The operational window was tight. In water, this shallow surface weather translates directly into bottom turbulence. An even modest swell can jerk the lifting cables into dynamic shock loads, enough to snap the fuselage in half. The team utilized a barge equipped with a heavy lift crane, but the crane could not do the work alone. A direct lift from the surface is the crudest method of recovery. It concentrates stress on a few rigging points and can tear a weakened airframe apart. Instead, the divers built a distributed suspension plan around the strongest surviving structure and used buoyancy balloons to help manage the load during the initial breakout from the seabed. The goal was control, not speed. Lifting smoothly, keeping the wreck stable, and minimizing shock. Once the aircraft was steadied, the crane took the final strain. The ascent was slow, deliberate, and aimed at surviving the most dangerous boundary of all, the surface interface. That boundary is where the physics invert. Underwater, displacement carries part of the load and makes a wreck feel lighter than it truly is. The instant the aircraft breaks the surface, that support collapses. Gravity takes full hold of the airframe, now heavier than it was in 1943 from the water, sediment, and marine growth trapped inside the wings and fuselage. Simultaneously, the wreck is exposed to the kinetic energy of the waves. If the crane does not lift fast enough, a single wave can slap the fuselage against the side of the barge or twist it on the cable, shearing off the wings. If the crane lifts too fast, the sudden weight of the trapped water inside the fuselage, which cannot drain quickly through the clogged drain holes, can cause the bottom skin to blow out. The WWII team managed this transition by coordinating the crane operator with the divers in the water. As the Stuka breached, the water streamed out of the fractured sections, lightening the load. The fuselage, still bearing the faint S7 plus GM codes, rose clear of the Mediterranean for the first time since the WWII campaign. The wargrave status of the site dictated the handling of the wreckage on the deck. The team could not simply hose out the mud to reduce weight. The sediment inside the cockpit was effectively a crime scene and a potential reliquary. The aircraft was lowered onto a prepared cradle on the barge, designed to support the weakened spine of the plane. The recovery was mechanically successful. The center section, wings, and cockpit were retrieved in one piece. However, the removal of the aircraft from seawater triggered a new immediate threat. Chloride-contaminated metal can deteriorate rapidly once it is exposed to oxygen-rich air and drying heat. That is why the first actions after surfacing focus on stabilization, washing, and applying chemical treatments designed to slow corrosion, buying time for the longer restoration work to begin. Upon securing the wreckage on the barge, the recovery team faced a decision that defines the modern philosophy of aviation archaeology: what you fix and what you preserve as evidence. In earlier decades, the impulse was often cosmetic, rebuilding missing sections and repainting until the machine looked whole. That can create a clean exhibit, but it risks sanding away the story. Here, the publicly stated plan was a restoration program beginning with immediate stabilization and documentation. In that kind of work, the scars still matter. Jagged holes, heat-stained fittings, and torn skin are not just damage, they are data. The discipline is to keep that data visible even while the structure is being made safe enough to move, study, and eventually display. The decision was made to preserve the Stuka exactly as it was recovered. This meant the objective was not to fix the aircraft, but to freeze it in time. However, this decision imposed a severe chemical constraint. The moment the wreckage left the water, the corrosion trap changed its mode of attack. While submerged, the corrosion was a slow electrochemical process. In the atmosphere, as the water evaporated, the chlorides trapped in the metal pores began to crystallize. This crystallization process is physically destructive. It expands inside the microscopic layers of the aluminum alloy, flaking away what little material remains and turning solid metal into dust. Without immediate intervention, a recovered aircraft can lose more structure in 2 weeks of air exposure than it did in decades underwater. The team had to move fast to arrest this cycle. The transport logistics required extreme caution. The wreckage was loaded onto a heavy transport vehicle for the transfer to the Hellenic Air Force Museum at Decay Air Base in Tatoi. The vibration of road travel posed a risk to the fragile structure. The crating system had to isolate the corroded longerons from the frequency of the road surface. If the fuselage flexed too much during transit, the oxide layers holding the skin together could pulverize, leaving the museum with a pile of dust rather than an airframe. Arrival at Tatoi marked the successful conclusion of the salvage phase and the beginning of the conservation phase. It was now out of the surge zone and out of reach of souvenir hunters. It was now a state asset, housed in a controlled environment. The outcome was a validation of the risk taken by the WWII divers. They had retrieved a verified piece of World War II history. Yet the visual solidity of the wreck was deceptive. The salt was still deep inside the rivets and the box sections of the wings. The recovery was technically complete, but the battle to save the metal was just beginning. The museum engineers now had to implement a chemical strategy to neutralize the ocean's legacy before it consumed what little remained of the machine. The final stage of an aircraft recovery is not a singular event, but a duration of chemical engineering. Once the wreck is in your custody, every hour becomes a decision about slowing the salt's next move. From there, the work moved into a staged conservation workflow. The wreck went to the local airfield at Maritza for first-degree steps, with the outer wing panels dismantled to make handling and transport safer. After that, it transitioned into the Hellenic Air Force Museum facilities at Tatoi, where the long program began, cleaning, stabilizing, documenting, and reassembling without forcing fragile metal to carry loads it can no longer bear. The preservation philosophy remained strict. No repainting, no cosmetic reconstruction. The aircraft was cleaned, stabilized, and reassembled only as far as the surviving structure would tolerate. To a casual observer, it looks incomplete, missing cowlings, canopy, and whole stretches of skin, but that rawness is intentional. It is an honest representation of the machine's history, from the factory floor to the combat over Rhodes to the decades on the seabed. The recovery of the airframe also closed the operational loop for the crew. While Lieutenant Rolf Metzger and Unteroffizier Hans Zonnemann were not physically recovered in a condition that allowed for a traditional burial, the retrieval of their aircraft changed their status in the historical record. They were no longer anonymous statistics lost in the Battle of the Dodecanese. The presence of their specific machine in a museum provides a tangible locus for their memory. Identification can give families and historians a firmer point of reference, turning an old question mark into a named event in the record, even when the sea has taken everything else. Today, the aircraft stands in the Hellenic Air Force Museum at D'Italia Air Base. It occupies a rare position in aviation history. It is among the very few surviving Ju87 airframes and one of the uncommon examples recovered from the sea in the Mediterranean region. Other surviving Stukas reached museums by very different routes. The Ju87 D-3 in the RAF Museum in London is a preserved war prize, captured on land and curated as a representative specimen. Chicago's Ju87 R-2 Trop is a comparatively complete survivor from North Africa, conserved and displayed in a dramatic dive. And there is at least one more Ju87 recovered from the Mediterranean itself, raised off Saint-Tropez in 1989, showing that Rhodes is not the only saltwater recovery, even if it is one of the most striking. Its value is not in aesthetic perfection. It is in survival, through combat, impact, entanglement, and corrosion. Long enough for engineers and historians to pull meaning back out of the sea without grinding the evidence into dust. That is what aviation archaeology ultimately does. It retrieves data from a hostile environment. The Ju87 is no longer a weapon of war. It is a stabilized forensic document showing that disciplined recovery can pull the past back to the surface without destroying it.